Well, it would pain me to think that we're not allowed to build in Rome Center, in part because it would effectively be acquiescing to the idea that the city is dead. Uh, and for the city to be alive in great part, it needs to imagine a future, and therefore the projective capacity of urbanists, architects, ecologists, citizens to imagine that these building types that have been so malleable and adaptable for so many centuries may yet again have other lives. But we also know that preserving a city isn't single faceted. Uh, to preserve Rome sometimes means to call on artisanal crafts that are effectively obsolete everywhere else in the world, but are alive and well there. Uh, to preserve Rome, there's acts of renovation that acknowledge that systems of building are different today and have to be introduced in a stealth way into old historic structures that don't take them well, but can adapt to them. I'm thinking of mechanical systems and all sorts of other things that um, may need to be embedded or encrypted into these buildings. But most importantly, or equally importantly, I should say, that there are things that can't happen without intervention. And to preserve the city, I'm claiming that intervening in the city means to acknowledge the constant present as part of that dialogue. The real question is, what kind of social contract do you create in uh, allowing that to happen? If you have a city that is part of a kind of historical patronage, and it's a heritage site, what do you allow, and what are the processes that oversee it, and what is the discourse that allows it, both within a legal as well as a cultural framework, to recognize that what you do today, uh, by definition, needs to be different than what was in the 19th and 15th centuries, and therefore uh, uh, imagine what essentially gets preserved as is and what gets transformed over time. But I, I, I would feel remiss to roll over and think that um, we freeze the world as is, because we know so well how dynamic the environment of the world is, and the cities, and how much they've evolved over time. So to freeze them is possibly the most artificial thing we could do, uh, all the while acknowledging somehow that uh, there have been things done to buildings uh, that are devastating. I think to ask that question has many dimensions, but I would maybe point to a political question that underlies it, that characterizes the last 40 years of yours and my life. When I arrived on these shores in the US in 1978, um, we still had a notion of the public realm. It was with the elections of Reagan that the incremental erosion uh, of public infrastructure became systemically incorporated into essentially a government charter, privatizing everything from infrastructure to health to education, among many other things. And the development model of cities through joint ventures and other privatized models, where public space is negotiated as privately overseen lands, uh, is a very meager response to an idea about the public realm. So, so first and foremost, what I think is really problematic is that at the governance level, I feel that um, policies have abdicated their responsibilities towards what we may have traditionally thought of as public infrastructure, public space, and the public realm. And by extension, I'm saying those rights that we have as citizens towards, clean air, water, education, health, and those other things that are part of a, let's say, an ecological system that holds cities and the landscape together. Um, Now, of course, uh, by extension, uh, ideas of public space come with uh, other responsibilities that architects oversee, and that has to do with the evolving nature of what we do in the public realm. Obviously, I suspect in Rome, as much as anywhere else, we saw a radical surge of the use of public space during the COVID era, just because it was the moment of respite that you had in the day to get that ounce of air that your apartment no longer, uh, could hold. Um, uh, I know that in Boston, the sort of the runs that I would take on Stora Drive would have to be done at 6 o'clock in the morning, because by 6 o'clock in the afternoon, it was so crowded, it was either uncomfortable, unsafe, or somehow overwhelming. But you know, if if that was not a demonstration of the kind of foresight that uh, Olmsted and others had, over 100 years ago, to imagine the civic role that these spaces have had for New York, Boston, among other places, then I don't know what has. But so I really think that as we look uh, into the evolutions of cities, also, uh, I'm thinking of Rome. Uh, I would also be interested, less in Piazza Navona, which we love, but actually those other spaces, even beyond, the piazza in front of Stazione Termini, or other places where you understand that the public realm is evolving, that the center of the city is no longer just the historic center, but it is the periphery, and that those spaces require a kind of civic dimension that bring people together, um, that we desperately need today. And by that, there's an acknowledgement right now that, I mean, two things. One is, ironically, how well we've done during COVID to be resilient and to, run our lives and education and everything. But two, that, uh, with the loss of tactility, social engagement, that there are palpable losses in mental health, well-being, emotional and psychological uh, containments, which we may have taken for granted in other periods. And so these public spaces have many a dimension to them that maybe not be something we articulate so easily in formal and spatial terms, but they have a uh, palpable function from a societal perspective, that the harms of which uh, uh, we are now seeing as a result of not having access to them.
So I think we
In part, your question may be twofold, in the sense that architectural practice or architectural practices have many dimensions insofar as certain architects specialize in uh, developer commissions, or other architects specialize in residential architecture, uh, while other architects acknowledge that practice is composed of many dimensions, some of which is more socially motivated, others commercial, and others private. Uh, to that end, I think models that uh, produce sustainability for practices um, are one to target. I don't think I know of, besides firms like forensic architecture, or you know uh, uh, mass design group, firms that are essentially set up either as nonprofits or as academically motivated think tanks. Um, they they occupy a particular niche, but there's a business model behind that people forget. Uh, they too pay taxes. They too get uh, ample finances in order to run that kind of practice. I think that, strangely, maybe the most difficult uh, way to engage your question is, how do you operate at a practice that desires and continues to engage multiple levels of commissions at the scale of urban design, landscape, architecture, institutions, private houses, and even art installations. I say this selfishly because that happens to be a dimension in which we still practice and we're still interested in. And I've realized that, curiously, you have to create a business model where you have to steal a little bit from Peter to pay Paul, in order that certain commissions allow you to bring back funds into the research pot that says, these are the 2 or 3 commissions that I'm doing for the community in order to advance these or other causes. Our engagement with Amman, Jordan, for an installation that had a certain aesthetic dimension was really just an alibi to create blankets for the refugees, a kind of loophole. Our support of our local community to uh, design new interior spaces for the church that's right behind me is a way of fostering support for the African American community in Boston that remains underfunded. Um, uh, there are many of these kinds of um, commissions or opportunities that we have that essentially don't make money, but they're they do bring in another dimension into one's practice. But behind them, behind the social and political underpinnings of such things, there is actually a business model that allows for it. And so uh, I've also come to understand that uh, beyond organically just slipping into them, as we are not only designers, but we're citizens, we vote, we, we make decisions about the future of our country. The actions that we take as architects have clear indications about what architecture can do for society. And insofar as architects do many things, they also, uh, let's say, have expertise in form, space, materiality, and organizational systems, much of which have a silent way to uh, liberate and constrain the societies that occupy them. I say this in a stealth way because often when you draw a space on a piece of paper, it seems abstract and open enough that nobody can imagine what dimensional attributes are too small, uh, what kinds of spaces are overly surveilled, and what kinds of spaces are not safe enough because they don't have eyes on them. These um, sometimes subtleties uh, are an important set of dialectical questions that go into entering into the public realm, as questions of diversity are not one directional. They actually have to do with maintaining a kind of ecological balance of many constituencies that come into these discussions as we do and engage in social work. Uh, I think that some of the best discussions I've had as a result of the Black Lives Matter movement is that uh, many people, Mario Gooden, uh, amongst many others, have also acknowledged that while questions of race are linked to the very underpinnings of what we call democracy in America, that democracy was built on slavery, that you can find parallels of this discussion, whether you're talking about the Turkish community in Germany, the Algerian community in France, or many other forms of inequities that happen elsewhere. And so this has also built a larger discussion about uh, uh, questions of equity from a global perspective, something that we cannot merely just localize anymore.